Your question assumes that a book emerges from desire or wish of some kind. Um, Sometimes a book is a response to suffering or rage. Um, I think that in the United States in the last years, but also in several other countries, many people have responded with outrage to perceived and actual injustices. Um, and it has been, of course, an ethical quandary how best to respond. For instance, in the case of state violence, one especially unjustified state violence, as we see in police violence or in the occupation of people or war, um, uh, the response can sometimes be a violent response. In other words, we respond to um, violence with violence. And some people would argue that state violence is different from popular violence, but I found myself worrying that if we respond to violence with violence, then we only create a more violent world. So my book is a plea to create a less violent world. The first is the one I just mentioned, that um, responding to violence with violence makes for a more violent world. Um, and perhaps the second is that very often we have a confusion, or we suffer from a confusion between state violence and non-state violence, or violence on the part of non-state actors. Some people on the left would say state violence is wrong and we must respond with um, popular violence to bring the state down or to effect a radical change in the state. Um, and some people who believe in the state or advocate for the state believe that state violence is always legitimate, or is for the most part legitimate, and that non-state violence is the illegitimate form of violence. So very often there is a confusion about what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. And people who are protesting nonviolently are sometimes called violent. And states are also, I think, um, considered violent when they use police force. And we have to ask, is all police force violent? Is it legitimate? Is it illegitimate? How do we distinguish between the crimes that police commit and the general violence of policing as an institution? So my book seeks to think about some of these distinctions and clarify some of the conceptual confusions that we suffer. I would also suggest that my book takes a point of view that is inspired by Gandhi, although I have some quarrels with Gandhi, um, namely that nonviolence is not necessarily a position of passivity, and it is not the same as pacifism. So when you translate this from English to French, make sure you do not translate nonviolence as pacifism. It's non-violence, pas de pacifisme. Um, and nonviolence can be forceful. Nonviolence can be aggressive. Nonviolence can be angry. And I think we perhaps make a mistake when we imagine that nonviolence is always a position of calm or of passivity. I think that strikes can be extremely forceful and nonviolent, um, that human barricades can be extremely forceful and nonviolent. So perhaps we can now think about a forceful or aggressive nonviolence and still make a world that is less violent. I do think that we must consider carefully self defense. And I I'm not interested in nonviolence as a set of abstract principles that are applied to every situation. I I do not follow um, a philosophical view that maintains that nonviolence be an absolute, internally consistent position. For me, it is an ethos. It is a guiding set of principles. But for instance, I believe that the Ukrainian people are uh, legitimately defending themselves against the state aggression of Putin's Russia. And I would defend self defense. I think feminist self defense is an important practice, and I affirm um, self defense as a practice and a protocol. I myself was trained in self defense as a young person. So there must be a response to violence, and it can be aggressive, it can be forceful, it can be physical. But the question is always there: is one reproducing a more are we is one reproducing the violence that is done to one, in which case it is revenge, or is one blocking violence through force um, in order to stop an aggression of an illegitimate and violent kind with an aggression that is forceful and seeking to put an end to violence? This is, for me, a key ethical question that emerges in the midst of political situations and also quite personal ones. Um, I understand revenge. I understand retribution. We all probably do. Um, but how do we think about self defense as neither revenge nor retribution, as stopping a violent blow and using physical force to do so? I also think that self defense is sometimes used hypocritically. Um, a state in inflicting violence will say, we're just defending ourselves. So we need to think critically whose self is being defended in this practice. Who has a self that can be defended? This is the key question that the philosopher Elsa Dorlin poses, and I take her question very seriously. Yes, it's true. Um, Very often, when we ask the question, um, is it morally defensible to act in a violent way? We ask it as a moral question that pertains to us as individuals. But I think that a philosophy of nonviolence requires a critique of a certain idea of individualism, one that is derived from the liberal tradition, the classically liberal tradition, and imagines the individual as a bounded creature, discrete from others. But one of the problems with acting in a violent way is that it breaks the bond between one person and another, or one group and another. And in fact, if we take the perspective that we are relational creatures, that we are interdependent, that we are social, um, in attacking another, we attack our own sociality, our own social bonds. And um, I think that if we approached the question of violence and nonviolence through this idea of social interdependency, we would understand better why nonviolence um, is an important, if not imperative, philosophy.